Okay, well, welcome back, everybody. Welcome back, everybody at home. Back to you all. Glad to see you again. And this time, we're going to build a little bit on what we did with our demographics last week. We talked about the different regions of the state and where the people are, the relative numbers, where the population goes. This time, we're going to get into how things eventuated during the early part of 1861. And again, how we talked about why people may have behaved the way they did because of the demographics. Now we'll talk about how Maryland behaved in the early part of 1861 and how things came about. So let's talk a little bit about the more of the political environment. We talked about, especially in Baltimore, the mob violence and how Baltimore was a really tough city with respect to politics and the odd politics of the city and the rest of the state. Interestingly, in the 1856 election, that was actually the second election where there was the existence of a Republican Party. The state of Maryland was the only state in the Union in that election to support Millard Fillmore for president. Everyone else, every other state elected, put James Buchanan in the White House. So Baltimore and Maryland was a place unto itself. The politics were different. It was a slave state with a large northern industrial city that had a lot of power. And one interesting thing that I noted was that in the 1850s, Baltimore, the city of Baltimore and the county of Baltimore went from having 1/16 of the membership of the General Assembly, State House, to 1/8 of the representation of the entire state of Maryland in the General Assembly of the state. So that put Baltimore in a much stronger political position to represent its interests. And i.e., that's generally highly different than the general interests of much of the rest of the farming agricultural community of Maryland. So that has been in the back of my mind throughout my ongoing study of Maryland and the Civil War. The fact that Baltimore had become such a political factor. And it kind of threw its weight around. And I think what we'll come to see at some point is that the influence of Maryland had everything to do with Maryland winding up staying in the Union, however tenuous that might have been. And it was tenuous. So let's go into a little bit about the 1860 election. As you remember, it was a four-person race. The Constitutional Union Party, which just came up basically at the last moment during the campaign of 1860, was led by John Bell. He was nominated president. The vice president, oddly enough, was the fellow who gave the introductory speech at Gettysburg before Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. His name escapes me right now. I'm sure one of you will think of it before me. But that was the Constitutional Unionist Party. And what basically they were saying is, well, we're not taking a stand on slavery. All we're saying is we're going to follow the Constitution. If we're elected, we're going to follow the U.S. Constitution. They had no threat against anybody. They were basically the centrist party. Then there was the Democratic Party, the Southern Democrats, led by John C. Breckinridge, who eventually became the vice president of the Confederate. No, he wasn't. He became a general in the Confederacy. He was from Kentucky, but he was the vice president of the United States. under Buchanan, I believe it was. And so these are, kind of he was a heavy hitter, although he was not popularly known as a secessionist even among Southerners. He was more of a centrist among Southerners. Stephen Douglas was the Northern Democrat. Douglas was the Democrat who down at the convention, and the first Democratic convention in Charleston, was expecting to get the nomination, but was repelled by the secessionist Democrats and was held back. And thus, that's why they had to have another convention in Baltimore later in 1860 to hash that out. And what happened as a result was that both Douglas and Breckinridge, the Democratic Party broke in two. And that's what gave Lincoln and the Republican Party, the upstart Republican Party, which was 1860, was only the third election that a Republican Party even existed in this country. And so Lincoln sneaked in, essentially, because of the major breakup in the Democratic Party. And of course, the Republican Party in Maryland did very little with Lincoln. He had 2.5% of the vote. But Breckinridge won a bare, he didn't win a plurality, he won a majority, he won a plurality of 45, just about 46% of the vote. The Constitutional Unionists had 45 and just over 45%, but the Douglas Democrats, who were not secessionists, whatever, had 6%, and plus the 2%. So even though Breckinridge won a slight plurality, the more radical type of Democrats didn't show that they didn't really control the state in the election. And so that was the question, and the answer was Lincoln won the election. Now, as a result of that struck the Deep South with like a hammer. The fear of, to whatever extent it was an absolutely true feeling, struck, and a lot of the immediate Deep South states felt that it was time to secede. There was a lot of talk about secession for months. There was talk of secession for 4 years before that. There was a regular threat in the Congress by Deep South and even, Middle Southern states, unless slavery was protected. Now, as he said earlier in the first week, a lot of people in the slave states felt like what was the best way to protect the future of slavery? Was it under the U.S. Constitution, or was it requiring a separation for another separation from the Union state by state? The answer came pretty quickly. If the election was November 1860, December 1860, December 10th, I believe, was the exact date, South Carolina met in Charleston, and they voted to secede from the Union. That famous Charleston Mercury headline, "The Union is dissolved," is, probably one of the most famous headlines in American history. And so, right from that point, later on that month and into January, the first 7 states seceded, all from the Deep South. South Carolina was first, and I think it was Mississippi, Georgia, Texas, Louisiana, Florida, and Alabama. So those were the original 7 states. However, after that, once it was in the middle of February and into March, the middle southern states, the middle slave states, had not felt the need to do so. And these were probably among the most populous of the slave states. That would be Virginia, which with 1.5 million population was clearly the #1 state that was a major slave state. But North Carolina was among the highest population-wise. Tennessee, Arkansas, and then you have the border states, Missouri, which contained the city of St. Louis. That was a strong population. Kentucky was very populous at the time, and of course Maryland, and technically Delaware was still a slave state, although there were just maybe a few thousand, it was less than 10,000 slaves. I think it was far less than that, probably lower, full 4,000. But the point is that they were on the fence. They required, and they talked about this, is so much written about it, and it's really written by they themselves, the people of the time. It's a well-recorded discussion that was going on between the time that Lincoln was inaugurated and the last of the original 7 Confederate states seceded. And in March, they formed the Confederate government in Montgomery, Alabama. The 7 states formed their government. And then what they did was they sent out emissaries, some of their leading, best articulated spokespersons. They sent them out to all of the other slave states to try to convince them that they should be joining the Confederacy. And I have a quote from one of them later on, but right now I just want to make sure that I cover how this eventuated. There was a lot of pressure on the non-seceded states to secede, and that included Maryland. Governor Hicks was under a lot of pressure from not only from those emissaries, but also from within the state, from the leading secessionists within the state of Maryland. There was an awful lot of pressure, and there was that same sort of talk with Virginia, but for whatever reason, there were enough unionists and enough union feeling in both Virginia and Maryland to ward off and insist that until they see some act from the Lincoln administration, some overt military act against the South to coerce the South and coerce the 7 states that had already seceded, that they weren't willing to secede themselves because they, had a strong affectation for the Union. That everyone, people thought long and hard before they would consider leaving the Union, especially in places like Virginia, which was one of the great founding states of the Union in the late, 18th century. But Maryland as well, the old line state was, played an integral role in forming the Union. So this is the position that we were in, that they were in, and they stayed the course despite the intense pressure from the leading secessionists. Now, so the pressure was building on Hicks to call a convention, to call a state convention, so that the General Assembly could decide whether to secede or not. And other states were doing the same thing. Even in March, the state of Tennessee, the state of North Carolina were putting the same pressure on their governors. But they decided also not to even call it conventions. And so here it is, late February, now we're into March. And Maryland's position was not strong for the Union or for secession. As a matter of fact, Governor Hicks and his leading politicians were very actively participating in all the efforts in Washington to try to find a compromise between both sides. The most famous is the Crittenden Compromise. Senator Crittenden from Kentucky was following in the shoes of Henry Clay as one of the great compromisers in the U.S. Senate, and he worked with a pretty large group of about 30. But there were several of these groups that worked on a daily basis, including many of the secessionist senators from North Carolina and the Middle states that had not seceded. And so they were all working very hard, feverishly. However, what was killing their efforts were the antagonists on both sides. The secessionists were very much against, because they wanted to accomplish secession. So they voted against the compromises. And then you had the hard and fast abolitionists who were still angry at those states that had seceded. So they were not going to compromise any further on, because they didn't want secession. So those compromises sort of drifted out. And then what happens is that after the Middle South decided largely that it was not going to secede, what happened? On March 4th, Lincoln is inaugurated as President of the United States. And the fear, in the South, the Deep South was already working feverishly at setting up their militias and their armies, getting armaments, artillery, doing everything they possibly could to build up, prepare for a large conflict. They thought the conflict was going to be very quick and easy, but they were still preparing. They were, militarily, they had thousands of young men that had volunteered state by state there, who were, ready to go. They had way too many volunteers that they couldn't arm and equip them all in the Deep South. So here's Lincoln takes the oath of office, but he tells the South that the issue of war is up to them, that he would not take aggressive action against the South unless in defense of Washington, in defense of the country, the rest of the country. But things are getting more and more intense, and among the emissaries was the emissary to Maryland, who was William Lowndes Yancey from Alabama, who was one of, I think I mentioned him last week. He was one of the Deep South's fiercest secessionists, fire eaters. He came to Maryland and he visited with members of the legislature who were the secessionists. Excuse me. But he had a much harder time getting with Governor Hicks. Governor Hicks gave him the cold shoulder and finally met with him, but gave him no warm feeling of fuzzy or of any kind regarding his desire to move Maryland out. He wasn't for the Union. He wasn't, saying he said we're not for secession. We want to maintain the Union, even if it is a middle confederacy as a buffer, in effect, between the Deep South and the abolitionists in the North. I don't know how, it turns out, it was a good thought, and he certainly had a lot of agreement, with the other border states, like there was that strong feeling in Virginia, the same with Kentucky, and I think largely in Missouri, although Missouri had probably more unionists than secessionists, because of the German influence in St. Louis. That was an important thing, much like Baltimore. So here we are, and tensions are getting worse and worse, and then one thing leads to another, and then comes the issue of starting to talk about the state of South Carolina. Governor Pickens of South Carolina was beginning to insist that the 70 or so Union troops in Charleston Harbor be moved out and away, back to the north and off of Southern property, off of the state of South Carolina's property. And fearing an attack, Colonel Anderson, who was in charge, received permission to move his 70 people all into Fort Sumter, which was a far stronger fort than the other three smaller, weaker Revolutionary War forts that also served as the guard for Charleston Harbor. So he did that, and that was something of a provocation to Governor Pickens and to South Carolina. They were looking for the provocation, and they were in communication with the new Confederate government in Montgomery. And so as the end of March came about, what was going on was that the resupply ships were going to be sent by the Lincoln administration from New York down, and Lincoln announced that the only thing on those ships was supplies, food for the 75 or 80 men in the garrison. But it was decided, Governor Pickens announced that he wasn't going to allow that to happen. And Jefferson Davis, the new president of the Confederacy, had tried very hard not to suggest to Pickens not to attack. And he made an inference that, having those 70 men in Charleston Harbor is like, a fly on your, arm. That's not the word, but it was something like that. I can't remember exactly what it was. But it was just something to just brush off. It wasn't important militarily. But what was also going on was the talk among the Middle South states that they were not going to secede truly, and the emissaries to those states came back to Jefferson Davis and the Southern Confederate cabinet and told them that there was little expectation that those states would secede if Lincoln didn't do something militarily to coerce those southern states. And so it was a decision that, I don't know if it was just Jefferson Davis or the cabinet, I think it was probably the whole Confederate cabinet, that decided that they were going to have to do something to get those, what was more important to them? Getting those other slave states to join the Confederacy. It looked a little ridiculous, I think, for 8 slave states not to be joining the Confederacy, 4 or 5 months after the initial state, South Carolina, had seceded. They knew that they had a lot of cotton, but they couldn't ship it. They didn't have a navy. They didn't have much in the boat. Most of the ships that sent the cotton out were Northern ships. They were British ships. They weren't owned by companies that were, in a sense, located in the South. The only real large ports were, the largest port, of course, was New Orleans, and great amounts of cotton were shipped there. But the South also needed the buy-in from England and France for recognition, so that they could be seen as a permanent fixture in the new order of nations. So that was also a major consideration of the Confederate cabinet as March moved into April of 1861. But back to Maryland. Maryland and the legislature and there was an awful lot of talk about, and worry, frankly, and rightly so, for Baltimore, for the large city of Baltimore. What had happened was that those who probably Unionists made the argument that if war was to start and Maryland went with the Confederacy, that the hordes would come racing right down between New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and Washington, and run over in anger, the edifice of Baltimore. It was in the way, and there was very little stopping them, and so that became a major outcry, not only because of Baltimore itself, but because the Eastern Shore, a large part of the economy of the Eastern Shore was creating the crops that fed Baltimore. And a large part of the northern tier was itself manufacturing and shipping things to Baltimore, to the port of Baltimore to be sent elsewhere. And that would have been destroyed. So the entire economy of Maryland was in serious jeopardy. And of course, they were aware of that. And so they talked about it. But when you stop and think about the size of, we talked about that the other day. I added these statistics. There were 6,000 jobs, 1,300 manufacturers and 22,000 jobs, industrial manufacturing jobs in the city of Baltimore. And there was nothing like that anywhere else in the South. That became the largest consideration for the people of the state of Maryland, no matter where they were. 4,000 jobs in ironworking, 1,300 in shoe and boot making, 1,200 jobs in packing oysters at the plants at the Baltimore Harbor area, manufacturing implements for making. Baltimore. This is interesting because Baltimore, in building new buildings, was already using bricks, and they were manufacturing huge amounts of brick here because Baltimore was growing so quickly. And that was a, integral part of the development of the city. Plus, of course, the railroad equipment was huge. So this had to be protected somehow. And there was little argument that could be made for, trying to protect Maryland if they joined in secession. North Carolina, Tennessee had nothing like that. Even Virginia had nothing like that. No factor like that needed that kind of protection. Besides, they were basically a lot safer than Maryland, which was right, bordered on the free states. So this was making it more difficult for Maryland to ever make a decision one way or the other. And that's why they so favored that middle Confederacy to be the buffer and not to get anybody mad and to try to make, out of it. But that process was falling apart because everyone that Governor Hicks sent to try to participate in that those great debates were foiled. And they couldn't pass that legislation that would get something done. So here we are. We're late in March and moving into April. The ships, the Star of the Sea was on its way to Charleston, and they tried to enter the harbor and were shot at. And they could not enter the harbor. They returned without feeding, without resupplying the garrison. That's the point where it almost became impossible for Jefferson Davis to put off South Carolina anymore, because they had already fired on the ship. So what happens was that Jefferson Davis and the Confederate cabinet felt that it would be not so good if the state of South Carolina led the way to take over Fort Sumter, that it should be the Confederate government that did that. And so that was the huge risk that was going to be taken by the Confederate government to, in effect, coerce the other slave states to join in the Confederacy. The original 7 didn't have enough people. They didn't have enough industry. It was like a banana republic with cotton. Now, cotton was essentially thought to be cotton is king, but you had to get it from where you are to where the spindles and the factories are, and they couldn't do that themselves. And they needed more men. Plus, they needed a buffer. That's what they did. And believe me, I don't have the quotes, but I've read enough to know where Virginians, Marylanders, Kentuckians, Tennesseans understood that they were the buffer of the Deep South. They knew that. And I'm sure I saw somewhere where General Robert E. Lee, before he was General Robert E. Lee, understood that. So they kind of resented it. But what happened was the firing on Fort Sumter. It was April 12th, 1861. I think I said last week it was April 15th. It was April 12th, 1861. What I was thinking was 3 days later, April 15th, was the day that Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the brigade. But on April 12th, and interestingly, doesn't get lost on me, and that is that the two people who essentially pulled the first lanyards to fire the first two shots at Fort Sumter were Roger Pryor of Virginia and Edmund Ruffin of Virginia, two of the state's strongest secessionists. Now, what they were doing in Charleston, South Carolina, they weren't playing golf at Myrtle Beach. But the point is, they were there to show that Virginia was participating and leading the way in the firing of Fort Sumter. That was a planned political act. And so it happened. Fortunately, there was no one killed. One Union soldier was killed the next day by accident, so there were no deaths. But he was firing on the U.S. flag. And whereas I think I mentioned last week that I don't think that Lincoln could have gotten any kind of reasonably sized army to invade the South without the South having literally fired on the U.S. flag. I think that that's probably a fact. And I think there are very few Northerners, whether they were abolitionists or not, who would have moved south and started shooting without that kind of provocation. So that's how it happened in terms of getting the war started. And now the middle slave states and the border slave states had decisions to make. And one by one, they made the decision, and they made the decision, most of them, along the middle area, to secede. And their issues with slavery were much stronger than the border states. And of the border states, Maryland was among the very weakest. I mean, Delaware was the weakest. Delaware made no attempt generally to make any move towards secession. The state legislature just stayed within the Union. But it was basically Virginia and Maryland. Those two states historically had been very close. There was an awful lot of communication along, over the Potomac and the Bay and everything. So there was a lot of talk about Maryland and Virginia doing things in unison. And so Virginia still had their strong and very grave doubts about joining the Confederacy. But after the firing on Fort Sumter, the pressure was so strong that the Virginia Unionists caved, and soon, just a couple of days, April 17th, April 15th, 16th, the legislature had been meeting all this time. They were in Richmond, the legislature, and discussing participating in compromise efforts and doing that sort of thing, discussing the relative merits of joining the Confederacy or staying in the Union. And so the Fort Sumter issue, and the key thing, Lincoln's call for 75,000 troops on April 15th, that pushed most of those states right over the edge to where they decided that it was time to secede. And essentially, they did, although, as you know, in the process, Virginia gave away or lost 33 counties in the western part, decided they were not going to secede, and they were essentially walking away from the state of Virginia as a group. The Shenandoah Valley counties essentially said we're not seceding, but they were too close and they were too important as the breadbasket of the state of Virginia to be able to secede from the state the way the western counties did, as those western counties were protected by the Allegheny Mountains. So Virginia went, and it was basically powered by the Tidewater planter faction. From colonial days, they had tremendous influence in that state, and they still do. But this time it was enough to get the state to secede. Maryland, on the other hand, was in the same. Of course, Virginia also had Governor Wise, who became the governor, and he was much more of a secessionist than the previous governor, and far more of a secessionist than Governor Hicks of Maryland. So Hicks, after the April 12th firing on Fort Sumter, still wouldn't call it a state convention. On April 15th, he received the request for providing the U.S. government with Maryland's quota of 75,000 volunteers. And that was a step too far even for Hicks. And he refused Lincoln's order for a quota. And as the other slave states that were still had not seceded, Kentucky, Missouri, all had not seceded, despite the firing on Fort Sumter. They called for secession conventions, and they did not pass. They could not pass a secession vote. In Maryland, it was, a little bit different. There was still pressure against secession in the state, despite all of there were many families, and I've mentioned some of them. The secessionists in Maryland, including Severn Peakle Wallace, Ross Winans, who was the chief engineer of the B&O Railroad, and the man who had created and invented many of the original locomotives that drove the first crucial, railway between Baltimore and Ellicott City, and then by 1855 had developed the railroad all the way out to Wheeling, Virginia. He was an avid secessionist, and he was also a member of the state legislature, so he had real power. But then there were the families, the old line families of Baltimore, most of which were, secessionists. Coleman Yellett, the Howard family, the Key family, the Lloyds, the Tillmans from the Eastern Shore were large, mostly secessionist backers. Goldsboroughs, in both on the Eastern and Western Shore. Marshall Kane was an avid secessionist. His son was a Confederate officer. I remember the names, the Dorseys and the Duvals, some of the original families from Anne Arundel County, where I used to live. They're very famous for their support of the Confederacy and joining at this point. John Merriman was a strong secessionist. Judge Carmichael was a strong secessionist. And of course, men like Bradley Johnson of Frederick, who were very strong in the militia, but they were also educated and political leaders in various parts of the state. So basically, it's fair to say generally that the old line of families in the state of Maryland were pretty strongly in favor of secession, and they wielded as much power as they possibly could, given their numbers in the state legislature. But there were also very well-spoken and articulate unionists who still felt that secession was the wrong thing to do, and that unionism was an integral part of the mindset of the state of Maryland, despite all those people whose families have been here since the firing, on Fort McHenry in Baltimore, in the War of 1812, and in the Revolutionary War days. That would be people like Governor Hicks, John Garrett, the CEO of the B&O Railroad, Johns Hopkins, who was a major financier, and one of the original financiers of the B&O and numerous other industrial businesses in Baltimore. Montgomery Blair, who became Lincoln's Postmaster General, was a Marylander from Montgomery County. And one guy who I think is really played an important role was John Pendleton Kennedy. And I wanted to talk about him, but I wanted to also mention the secessionist newspapers and unionist newspapers were also playing a key role in formulating opinion in the state, pushing for their readership to go the way that they suggested. The Baltimore Sun, I think I put some of these on the wrong line, but the Baltimore Sun was strongly secessionist. In Easton, the Easton Gazette was the unionist paper, the primary unionist paper, and the Star Democrat was the key secessionist paper. The Baltimore American was a unionist paper in Baltimore. And there was basically, I think I said 7, there were 3 German language newspapers, dailies in Baltimore in 1860. I think I said 7, there were 3. But that's enough. The point is that all of them were strongly unionist. And most of the immigrant community, whether they were Irish or German or whatever they were an integral part of the working people of Baltimore. And they last thing that they ever wanted to do was compete against slave labor. So they were strongly unionist, and they understood that what would happen if slavery was introduced into the working community in Baltimore, which was built on the Northern model without slavery. So, influencers. The key influencer, I believe, for unionism in Maryland was John Pendleton Kennedy. He's an interesting guy, and I thought I would call attention to him. I had seen a copy of his pamphlet, so I thought I would kind of summarize him, because I think he was a really strong driving influence behind Governor Hicks and some of these other, Baltimorean and others. There were unionists who were not from from Baltimore. There were unionists, strong unionists on the Eastern Shore, and especially up in the northern tier, Hagerstown, Frederick, and along there, because there was an awful lot of industry there, and those people were about to lose it if the South seceded, if Maryland seceded with the South. So Kennedy was a former Speaker of the Maryland House of Delegates during his career. He was born in 1795. He only lived to 1870, but he was born in 1795 in Baltimore. So he was a Baltimorean. His mother was a Pendleton, and that's one of the big Revolutionary Warrior names in Virginia. So his father was an immigrant, but an educated immigrant who became something of a leader. So he joined the Whig Party earlier in his career, and he worked his way up as Speaker of the House of Delegates, serving in both houses, was a U.S. Congressman for a while, and was also the Secretary of the Navy under, not Buchanan, but right before the president before Buchanan. Pierce, thank you, Franklin Pierce. So he was a pretty well-known senior type of person. He also had some distinctions. He was a director of the B&O Railroad. He was a strong advocate for religious tolerance. He led the city of Baltimore and the state to allow other than Christians, i.e. Jews, to serve in the state legislature and to be community leaders, to serve in official capacity. They couldn't do that before the 1850s in Maryland. He was an abolitionist, but not a passionate abolitionist. He was also, for the longest time, an advocate for the Middle States Confederacy before the firing on Fort Sumter. But he wrote an extremely influential pamphlet, which I think explains essentially the Unionist rationale for not seceding under any circumstances. And I think he wrote it, I forgot exactly when, but not longer than a month or two prior to the firing on Fort Sumter. But he said secession would be nothing but ruin for Maryland. The free trade policy would cripple Maryland's manufacturing. That Maryland was vulnerable to a Union blockade of the Chesapeake. Even the secessionists knew that unless they could move Southern products in and out of the Chesapeake, there was no way that they could serve, Baltimore could serve as a Southern seaport. It was going to be blocked. And they sort of understood that. Had Kennedy's pamphlet put it there in writing in stark contrast to what some people were chattering. And so that also had a very impact. The fact that there was no defensible border on the line between Washington and Northeast made that was a killer for those who sought to secede, and for anyone supporting the Union. The fact that Maryland was right there on the border with large states, transportation right to the border. Maryland was right in the crosshairs if it seceded. And crucially, for slaveholders, he pointed out that it was much easier for slaves and those who helped slaves get away to have a border with a foreign country instead of another state. The Slave Act,
The
Fugitive Slave Act would no longer be honored by the North if the South, if Maryland and other states seceded. Why would they honor that? It would hurt them, and they could help remove slaves from the South. Very few slaves, even from Maryland, ever escaped. Minimal numbers of slaves ever really escaped especially from the Deep South. That was basically a talking point, but it really didn't have much of an effect on the negative effect on the slave states. But they insisted on it. But so it was always a thorn in the side of northern and southern states. But if Maryland seceded, there was no holding back slaves from leaving, and it would be very difficult for slave owners to maintain their slaves. Once the word got out among the slaves, they would be gone. Okay, and so here was the last issue was the tax burden would be extremely bad on the South, on Maryland if they seceded based on the Confederacy's published policies, and trying to reintroduce slavery in Baltimore's working class community simply was out of the question. So for those reasons, I think that Unionists and Kennedy and like Hicks had really much stronger argument, even in Virginia, which was a much larger state, far more difficult to to overcome, to force and to take over. Maryland would have been easy pickings for the Northern armies. And I believe they understood that. And so when Lincoln made his call on the 15th for 75,000, even though Hicks refused, Virginia seceded effectively on the 17th of April, even though they didn't ratify it until the 23rd of May. The time for talk was over. And Marylanders had to decide there was not going to be any Middle Confederacy because the rest of the Middle South had seceded. The strong expectation was that Kentucky would have seceded. Virginia had seceded, that was a border state. And so talk of being a Middle Confederacy without Virginia was not strong at all. It was hardly an argument. So here we are. We're at the point where on the 17th, with the day after, word is now that troops are now on the border of Maryland seeking to enter the state and cross the state to get to the defense of Washington, D.C. First was Pennsylvania. It was a Pennsylvania unit. And then the word was clear that troops were on their way from Massachusetts and New York. And so in Baltimore and in the state legislature, the pressure was intense, completely became too intense for Hicks to try to do anything anymore to hold it off. So as the Baltimore riots were occurring, soon later that day, Hicks called for the state legislature to meet, but not in Annapolis, in Frederick, because Annapolis had already been the beginning of the troop movements through Annapolis toward Washington were underway, and thus he decided to move that meeting to Frederick. And that's where the oddity of the results of that convention are still almost inexplicable from my standpoint. The business of having secessionists there and articulating what Lincoln had done as far as showing that he was willing to coerce Southerners by calling for 75,000 troops to invade the South. That was anathema to them. There was nothing that Lincoln could do anymore to satisfy their passion, their desire, because they were a slave state. How could they support coercion against other slave states, their brother slave states? And so they were totally committed. And during that meeting, they made several strongly worded resolutions condemning Lincoln's administration, condemning any sort of coercion of those states, saying that those states, taking the position that the state of Maryland legislature strongly supports the legality of states seceding from the Union, even though it didn't. They felt very strong, and they put it in writing. They voted on it, and they communicated it to Hicks and to the Lincoln administration. But when it came time literally to get both Maryland out of the Union, somehow they came up with the notion that they didn't have the authority to take the state of Maryland out of the Union. Much to that was the primary goal of the Unionists in the state.
not to secede from the Union. So that was essentially, and I can't explain that. I can't explain taking that position, considering how they were pressuring Hicks to call the convention to get Maryland to leave the Union for weeks and months. When they got there, they didn't do it. And why? Because of the obvious, I think, because of the obvious pressure of the destruction right on the other side of the border with Pennsylvania and the rest of the North. But nobody came out and really said that. Nobody really announced it that way. There was just frustration and clear anger by many of the delegates, including a lot of the Unionists who felt that the South should never have been coerced in any way, despite the fact that they used military might to fire on the flag. And of course, many other states felt that that was no question anymore, that even though we honor you and we honor, but that you've broken the Constitution, you dishonored the Constitution, you challenged, you left the country without our permission. And so we're going to fight you over that. And so whereas hundreds of thousands of Union, Lincoln called for 75,000 troops, that call was answered very, very quickly from the northern states. And later on, the next year, within months, he had asked for 100,000 more when he realized that it wasn't going to be a 3-week or 2-month war. And so he called for more, and he continued to get them. States like Massachusetts provided more than double their quota in the first month of after Fort Sumter, because they were passionately Unionist and with a passionately abolitionist Governor Andrew. And effectively, they did manage to, I believe, there was people like that who managed to save Lincoln's body, from being attacked and assaulted and kidnapped across the Potomac to Virginia. As I think I mentioned last week, I believe that could easily be done in the first, at the point where Lincoln had no one in Baltimore to protect him, and there were numerous Confederate Southern militia units in Maryland, Baltimore, who could have just literally hopped on the train and gotten to Washington and gotten across the Potomac with him. That didn't happen. Enough troops arrived in Washington at one point or other to defend Lincoln. But that is the great, conundrum of what happened in the state of Maryland. Yes.
The April 19th riots and the idea of casualties.
Categories?
Casualties.
Casualties, yes. Four Massachusetts troops were killed. About 30 or so wounded, hurt badly. Bricks and shot, wounded that way. 10 or 12 citizens were killed. And not that many more were badly hurt. The ones who were shot were the ones who were badly hurt and killed. People weren't throwing bricks at them. They were just trying to defend themselves. The troops were trying to defend themselves. So that was the casualty number. But that was the first major, what seemed like a major bloodletting. It turned out that it wasn't a major bloodletting in the Civil War battles way, but it was the first, and it had an electric impact on the rest of the country. Interestingly, I'm reading a book by Colonel Howard, the brother of the publisher, a member of the Howard family, and he pointed out in his book, which was written years later, he survived the war, but he pointed out that part of the passion in Baltimore to defend Baltimore and to keep Union troops out was because they knew they were from Massachusetts, and they despised the abolitionists in Massachusetts. And that had that Massachusetts impact was not lost on the secessionists in Baltimore, who were part of that mob that day. And it was to me, as I was reading it, I was like, oh, shocked to read that by young Mr. Howard, who was a young man at the time, who was an up-and-coming officer in the Confederate cavalry. Among the secession, he was part of the secessionist militia that fought those Union troops in Baltimore. So it was an important thing, and it had a immense effect, but not enough of an effect to get the legislature to be able to push through secession. And is it surprising? I mean, I don't think anybody really knows all the nuances of what happened in Frederick, Maryland for those couple of days. But obviously, in the weeks and months to follow, many of those secessionists who joined the Confederacy went and fought for the Confederacy, but others were not soldiers. They were just politicians. They remained. And they were constantly pushing for secession. One way or another, they were pushing. All of a sudden, they forgot about the point about, well, we don't have the power to do that. But then came, I suppose they felt like it was important to call for an election, a general election of all the people to decide on the question of secession. But in a practical sense, it was too late to do that because people were already taking sides. People were literally at war. I mean, what is the thing that strikes me as the most impactful for the state is that after April 19th, there was still passion in the streets for several days. But the fact that Union troops skirted Baltimore and went around and came down by steamer to Annapolis, thence to Relay House, and then back on the B&O back to Washington, D.C. That made a big difference because there was nobody to fight in Baltimore. The troops were not coming through. The bridges were burned on the Patuxent River, the Gunpowder River, and one other one which I forgot. I saw it, now I forgot it. But the Bush River, and the old Gunpowder River were the two bridges that were burned north of Baltimore after the riots by Merriman and that group. As a result, Baltimore all of a sudden didn't have food. They realized that it was a harsh reality. Because they burned those bridges, they didn't have their shipments of food from the north. Like I suppose they were getting them up the Chesapeake from places like the Eastern Shore. But things had changed overnight. There was a panic for the price of food was skyrocketing immediately. And so those bridges were quickly rebuilt by Baltimoreans, by probably some of the same people who burned them, simply so that they could have that connection, that economic connection with Pennsylvania and the North. So those were the kinds of realities that set in, and that probably, helped in the final decision. Although I suppose it's fair to say, many people didn't consider it a final decision. Secessionists did not. And they acted, to follow up on their beliefs for the state of Maryland. It was their passions were too strong to just take one road or another. They had to, they apparently just felt so passionate about either seceding or defending the Union that they never gave up. To me, one of the telling issues is that after the 19th, there were no further riots in Baltimore. like I said, the union for the long, until mid-May, when General Butler occupied Federal Hill. No Union troops really came through Baltimore. And so essentially, it allowed the natural unionism of most of those workers who were going to lose their jobs. They were going to lose their livelihood if the normal commerce of the city of Baltimore ceased. And they kind of depended on that to live their lives. And as literally as the war went, so they got back to work. And there were no more instances of riots. There was, over the next 3.5, 4 years, there were no discernible efforts at sabotage. Confederate sabotage of the B&O railroad system could have been catastrophic for the entire Union supply effort through Baltimore. Anything like that, the Thomas Viaduct south of Baltimore, between Baltimore and Washington, that was a crucial, that would have been a major blow to the ability of the Lincoln administration and northern states in the Northeast to keep moving troops, to keep resupplying. I'd also say that over the 4 years of the war, Baltimore and essentially Maryland were integral parts of the Union victory. Just the B&O Railroad alone, with the locomotives that they had huge heaps of wrecked locomotives in Baltimore that were transported back wherever they were wrecked. They would get them on, transport them back, pile heaps of them, melt them down, and build new equipment, build new locomotives. Locomotives were also built in other states and used here. But the point is that the B&O was local, and it was Marylanders who were doing the work, for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. They were making trestles, they were making, rail cars, they were making rails. They were, the joke among troops in the Army of Tennessee in 1864 was that Sherman, would always seem to have replacement rail. They could blow up any bridge and they could break any rail, they could break any road. But Sherman always had spare locomotives, cars, rails, trestling. A lot of that stuff was made in Baltimore and moved over the years. And Marylanders were doing that work. In 4 years, there were no substantial, any significant sabotage anywhere. There were no strikes. Baltimoreans weren't forced to go to work by Abraham Lincoln or the Yankees. Baltimoreans who sought to secede, they went south, and many of them did. But the vast majority stayed, and the vast majority worked every day, essentially, for the Union effort. And there's no mistaking that. The other side of the coin is that most of the northern tier of counties also did the same sorts of things. And oddly enough, it was the Eastern Shore counties that continued to supply Baltimore with their food. And not only that, but we here supplied the northern armies throughout the war with all the canned food and all the additional contracts, all the government contracts that were issued out here for the entire panoply of materials needed by the Union Army. Now, did they smuggle some things across the bay and across the Potomac? Sure, but it was minuscule by comparison with the North. And we'll talk about this in the last session, but I found a reference in one of the books to where banks on the eastern shore in Talbot County. The banks basically had 4 times the deposits in the accounts of people who had bank accounts after the war in 1865 than they did in 1861. So people were making considerable amounts of money out here. Even though they had lost their slaves, they were still making money from any number of things. Most all of them were literally supporting the overall Union effort that was centered in Baltimore. And that's why Baltimore played such a crucial role, not only in transportation, but in shipping, manufacturing, clothing, all of those things that were begun before the war. They were built quickly, and all of a sudden they were prospering like mad. Blacks had no trouble working in Baltimore. There were jobs for everybody. Everyone prospered. That also hurt. It hurt the Union Army recruitment efforts. Who would want to leave a job where they were working hard every day to go fight, and get paid, was it $12 a month or $14 a month? That was the other side of the coin. But that was the reality of what happened in this state, starting right at when the state decided not to secede. The Baltimore secessionists pretty much left. I have reference to that on the 3rd page of this handout. And this is from the Kruger book. Baltimoreans continued to work and the city continued to function. Federal troops began moving through Baltimore on a regular basis, while Baltimore merchants and industrialists began accepting government contracts for a myriad of military needs. In reality, Baltimore served as an integral part of the Union industrial, transportation, and manufacturing effort for the whole duration of the war. Managers and workers voluntarily went to work with virtually no strikes, sabotage, or significant unrest. Interestingly, in Baltimore, there were 25,000 free blacks in a city of 280,000 people. In New York, there were half that many blacks in a city of 875,000 people. And in the city of 875,000 people, with huge numbers, huge amounts of work, great shipping, huge port, all kinds of government contracts, there were the draft riots where African Americans were murdered on sight virtually for no apparent reason because some poor folks were getting drafted. And their reaction to being drafted by the Union in 1863 was to refuse to do that. They didn't want to lose their jobs, but they went after the African Americans who were free blacks, who were working, who were effectively competing with them. In the city of Baltimore, in a slave state with twice as many free blacks, nothing like that occurred. That was a political thing. It was the Democrats in New York City who essentially fanned the flames against the poor immigrants who were working, who finally had good jobs in the midst of the war. And they essentially gave them the opportunity to fan the flames to make them revolt and resist the draft, but also to go out ahead and attack, murder African American black children, as a matter of fact. So that's the difference. And it's a tribute essentially to Maryland and to Baltimore that they were able to accomplish this and maintain strong order, preserve the state. Maryland, I don't want to think about what would have happened to Maryland if it had seceded. And it would not Baltimore would have been wrecked. Oddly enough, during the war, and we'll get to this next week, when Baltimore was invaded especially during the Gettysburg campaign, part of Lee's strategy was to win a huge victory in Pennsylvania and then come down and destroy the infrastructure of Baltimore and take over Washington. Who was invading Baltimore to destroy the infrastructure? Who raided into Maryland numerous times to destroy the B&O Railroad and the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal? It was the Confederates, who couldn't bear to have a strong Maryland on the side of the Union. That's what was crucially important to Jefferson Davis, Lee, etc. Maryland had become a force on behalf of the Union movement in the Civil War. So that essentially is how we came to where we are as a state, and even though the state of Maryland dragged an awful lot of people along with it, secession, people who fought against the Union, shot at the Union soldiers. The state essentially stayed faithful to the Union. Interestingly, in the South, where I lived in Georgia for 10 years, anybody who was a Georgian who fought for the Union wasn't welcome back. The same, I think it's fair to say, with Virginia. Men like the Rock of Chickamauga or General Thomas. He was never welcomed back in the state of Virginia, and by his relatives. He was a traitor to the state. State seceded. Robert E. Lee famously indicated that, I'm a Virginian. I have to go with my state. He said secession was nothing but revolution. And I am against secession, but my state seceded, so I have to secede. And he did. And he made that famous. And many Southerners felt similarly because of what Robert E. Lee said. Not so much with Maryland Unionists and Maryland secessionists. They fought for the South, and they had very little to apologize about. They never did. They came back and were welcomed back by their families and neighbors who largely fought against them during the war. So Maryland was a huge question mark. It was before the war. It was at the outset, especially. And even during the war, with so many numerous Marylanders, fighting on the side of the Confederacy. So there are no really easy answers. And still, to me, in everything that I've ever read about the Civil War, Maryland is still the most confusing and mixed up kind of state. And I think it still is, because I think that so many people after the war adopted what is called lost cause view of the war. That has become, what we read about in our history books. That is what the version that we learn as children in our school systems throughout the North and throughout the South. But Maryland was, in my view, one of the most confusing and complex states, in the Union. It's really important that we continue to learn about it, and think about it, and be aware of the true reality of what happened in this state. It's really it's a great story. Maryland survived and thrived largely. Although after the war, we went right back into the Jim Crow South like nobody's business. And whereas the black soldiers came back, U.S. colored troops, they were essentially rejected. They couldn't buy property. They still couldn't go to school. And they weren't wanted in the state. They wanted those folks, the African Americans, to leave. There was a lot of pressure on them for 100 years after the war. In following Jim Crow law, that's what happened. And who came back? The Southerners came back. This county, they had a statue put up in their honor 50 years after the war was over, to the complete absence of Union soldiers from the county and any black soldiers from the county. So, that's just part of what happened. Slavery was removed from the Constitution and was never actually technically in it, but it was always adopted. And so after the war, there was no more slavery, but there was still no shortage of racism, white supremacy, not just in Maryland, but largely throughout the country. Questions? Questions among our Zoom folks? Be happy to try and answer.
Yes. Well, as slaves headed north through, and through the state, was there an official policy about people who stole them, or was it just informal?
You mean during the war?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yes and no. Yes. The question was about, was there an official policy in the state of Maryland about selling slaves?
Or even slaves escaping?
Or slaves escaping, right. Interestingly, in May of 1862, there was a huge impact on slavery in this state. U.S. Congress passed a law outlawing slavery in the District of Columbia. Within days and weeks, hundreds at first, slaves from Montgomery County and Prince George's County right across the river began walking off the plantations and just crossing into D.C. and establishing themselves into a tent city in Washington, D.C. They were free. Very few of them were given back to their masters who came after them. So that became the de facto way that many slaves in the Washington area just walked off the plantation starting in 1862. Here, it was different. In those counties, there were far more slaves than free blacks. If you look at that demo thing from the last week. In this area, on the eastern shore, it took longer for that to happen. The way it did happen was once the Emancipation Proclamation hit, of course, the value of slaves continually was plummeting from the beginning. Starting in 1862, the value of slaves almost collapsed to where slave owners in 1863 on the eastern shore were glad to get $300 to sell their slave, essentially to give that slave his freedom to join the U.S. colored troops in the United States Army. So many free blacks joined the Army from the eastern shore and from throughout the state. But in this area, especially, it was how fast could a slave owner get $300 for his slave, who he knew was going to probably just quit and join the Army anyway. That was the reality. So there was no real rule. It was just how were things happening? Where were the recruiters going? And to what areas were they going? And how fast could the slaves escape as a group, small groups, and just get away and join? Or could they go, for example, to Easton, or to the U.S. Post in Cambridge, or to Chestertown, and just get away and join and just apply for and join a unit and just say that they were free black? Who knew? There was no, postage stamp. There was no tattoo on a black. You could just say who you were. So it was madness, so to speak. And clearly, the value of slaves was going down. And so it was in the interest of the slave owners to sell the slaves before they could emancipate themselves. And over on the Western Shore, it was more bedlam because quickly Washington D.C. population of blacks grew to where they knew they could get jobs helping out. They didn't have to join the army. In 1862, they just joined and got jobs working as helpers for all the different regiments that were located in Washington D.C. There were hundreds of those units, and they all needed people to do the dirty work, and they could get paid for it. So they did, and that was the death knell for slavery in these areas. That's how it eventuated. Now, in areas like St. Mary's, in the southernmost counties of the state on the Western Shore, not so much. It was still difficult for those people, for those blacks to escape. And there was still a very high percentage of slaves to free blacks in those more isolated counties. But largely, it was the death knell for slavery. As time went on, and once the Emancipation Proclamation and Lincoln and the administration started recruiting blacks for the army, it was pretty much the end. And of course, in 1864, the state of Maryland abolished slavery by a very close vote, and it didn't help after the war to prevent Jim Crow. But the point is that the state abolished slavery in 1864, and that was the official end. So, yes, ma'am, do you?
Was there slavery in the northern states?
Was there slavery in the northern states? There were still a handful of slaves in the northern states, but for the most part, each northern state had abolished slavery, most of them at the turn of the 19th century. A late 1700, early 1805, in that 1810, most of them had done that. Now, some had grandfather slaves, and so there were still handful of slaves in New Jersey and in some other states. I think that Vermont was the first state that completely abolished slavery and gave slaves, former slaves, their citizenship. But the fact is that, England and France had abolished slavery, and they kind of led the way. And our northern states did the same thing. Now, was it easier for them? Sure. They didn't have 4 million slaves in the northern states. So it was a little hypocritical, but the fact is that they still did. And they had a handful of grandfather type black people. Yes?
During the time of the Fugitive Slave Act, there were northern communities that cooperated with that to catch runaway slaves. Is that not the case?
Well, there were southern agents. The Fugitive Slave Act was a product of the Compromise of 1850. And that was important. It was important as a pat on the back to the slave states, because in effect, as I mentioned earlier, they didn't really lose very many slaves. They had 4 million slaves. I mean, they lost fewer than 1,000 slaves a year to
Runaways.
right, especially in the deep south. It was almost, unless you got on a ship somewhere, there were mulattoes who were very light skinned who found ways to escape. But that was such an exceptional number. It was a pittance. But yes, in the North, Southerners had agents in the South. And part of the deal was that if you were an agent for a slave owner or a group of slave owners in, say, the state of Mississippi, and you were in Pennsylvania or New York or Massachusetts, and they were there, all you had to do was to identify a slave, a former slave who had escaped, by some photo perhaps or some other identifier, and take that slave, capture him, take him before a judge and say, this person was a slave, an escaped slave of my client, so-and-so, and the fee for that would be $10. The fee for the judge saying, no, you're wrong, was $5. So that was the law.
So there was support then in the North of capturing and returning runaway slaves.
Yes, there was a good deal of that. On the other hand, again, these were mainly agents of slaveholders.
But they had to go to northern
They
judiciary
went exactly.
officials,
Right.
which represented their state.
Right. The other side of the coin there, though, is, for example, in states like Massachusetts and New York, there were groups that would protect the slaves, and there were slave catchers who were murdered in the.
Well, this was not a legal thing. This was
It was legal because of the Fugitive Slave Act, but there were groups that supported slaves who were poor.
in the shadows.
Right. Exactly. Yes.
Or the ones that were kidnapped, free blacks that were kidnapped and shipped south
Exactly. Well,
as slaves. I read a very
Oh,
interesting
yes.
book,
yes.
based in Philadelphia, and this is a true story of 5 boys, teenage boys that were kidnapped and taken south, and I think 1 or 2 of them finally got back.
Yeah, there was so much, you couldn't identify. These slave catchers could find any free black and say, this is a slave. What could they do to help themselves? They couldn't. That's why some of these poor innocent blacks who were already living in freedom, they started getting the support of their neighbors and friends, and that sort of grew. And they would help these people not only get just over the border, but far north. And that's why, for example, Frederick Douglass lived in for a good while in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and then wound up in upstate New York, Rochester, New York. So there were they had plenty of company, and many blacks who escaped literally went all the way to Canada because it was safer there. So yes.
How did the Confederacy, were they able to establish any relationship with France and England? And they were trying to.
Well, here's what the Confederacy did at the very beginning of the war. It was a huge mistake. They embargoed cotton. And so essentially they were trying to coerce England and France to recognize them officially as a state. And so they decided to embargo cotton and not sell anything to Europe, any European, much less northern cities, so that they could force recognition by Europe, which was, crucially important in the family of nations around the world. But especially the English government, Lord Palmerston, and especially, they had their problems within, well, for England especially, because most of the people who worked in the mills in Manchester and all the cities, all those working class cities in England, they essentially supported the Lincoln administration. They were anti-slavery. Remember, England had abolished slavery. And here they were acknowledging a nation that broke off from a nation because to make slavery permanent, part of their constitution, the Confederate Constitution. And so the people were educated enough in Europe, France and England especially, to where there was pressure even on Lord Palmerston to not support the South. They did in subtle ways by helping finance ships, building of ships for a fledgling Confederate Navy. But essentially, they had their backs to the wall too, and they once this is, and we'll talk about this next week, the importance of Lee's first invasion of the North, ending at the Battle of Antietam. That effectively killed any true hope, reasonable hope of European recognition. Because the South invaded the North and was repulsed. And that was sort of a strategic death knell for European recognition.
The Emancipation Proclamation also. The Emancipation Proclamation.
And that
That
was,
was another thing that
right, that
made it
came,
more difficult for you.
that came months later.
Yeah.
And interestingly, of course, the Emancipation Proclamation was seen as, let's go ahead and do it by Lincoln because of Antietam.
Yeah.
So strategically, that was a costly mistake by General Lee. That invaded without really announcing it officially to Jefferson Davis and the Confederate cabinet until he was literally across the Potomac River. But that's another story. We're a little over on the 30. We okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. We'll see you next week. Thank you at home. See you now.